I'm so excited to be a part of this event, so let's begin. I first want to introduce the topic of environmental justice. Environmental justice is the fair treatment of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, and income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. As we continue our fight against structural racism in Maryland in defense of Black lives, it is crucial that we recognize the environmental toxins and harms that communities of color have long been exposed to purposefully. We hope this discussion will help us gain an understanding of how environmental injustices impact communities of color in the state of Maryland and how grassroots organizations and the government are working to fight environmental inequalities. Before formally introducing our speakers, I want to extend a huge thank you for your participation in this event. Thank you for coming today to help introduce topics of environmental justice to the SMCM community. Also, thank you to Maddie, our moderator and the 2020 Sustainability Fellow, and Atlas, the Q&A moderator and the Sustainability Intern. Without you guys, we would not have been able to organize this. A few housekeeping things to address. First, please add your preferred pronouns to your name so we may address you correctly. Secondly, please remain on mute. And lastly, we'll be having a Q&A session at the end, so direct your questions to Atlas throughout the discussion. Now to introduce our wonderful speakers. Joining us tonight is Rabbi Nina Cardin. A proud native of Maryland, she is the co-founder and director of the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights. She's been involved in environmental advocacy for more than 15 years, during which time she served as director of the National Coalition on Environment and Jewish Life, served as chair of the Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, and served as a sustainability consultant for the Central Maryland Ecumenical Council. Welcome, Nina. Next, we have Senator Mary Washington. She's an advocate for Maryland's 43rd District as a legislator, professor, ally, public policy leader, and trailblazer. In 2010, Mary made history becoming the first openly LGBT identifying African American elected official in Maryland, and only the second such legislator in the country. A devout activist, Senator Washington played a leading role in legislative work to establish marriage equality, prevent discrimination against transgender Marylanders, implement the Maryland Dream Act, and advance environmental justice. Welcome, Senator Washington. Next, we have Fred Tutman. He's a grassroots community advocate for clean water in Maryland's longest and deepest interstate waterway, and holds the title of the Tucson Riverkeeper, which is also the name of the nonprofit organization that he founded in 2004. Fred taught courses in environmental law and policy at our very own St. Mary's College of Maryland, and is the recipient of numerous regional and state awards for his various environmental work. He is the longest server waterkeeper in the Chesapeake Bay region and the only African American waterkeeper in the nation. Welcome, Fred. Next, we have Delegate Sara Love. She serves on the Environment and Transportation Committee and its two subcommittees, Transportation and Motor Vehicles and Land Use and Ethics. She also chairs the Montgomery County House Delegation Land Use, Transportation, and Public Safety Committee. Prior to her election, Sara was the Public Policy Director for the ACLU of Maryland, where she led their policy and legislative work for 4 years. During that time, she worked on many issues, including reproductive rights, racial justice, public funding for public schools, and criminal justice reform. Welcome, Delegate Love. Next, we have Dr. Sacoby Wilson. He's an associate professor with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, School of Public Health at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Wilson has over 15 years of experience as an environmental health scientist, and he is director of the Community Engagement in Environmental Justice and Health Initiative, which is focused on providing technical assistance to communities fighting against environmental injustice and environmental health disparities in the DMV region across the nation. Welcome, Dr. Wilson. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm now going to turn it over to Maddie to start a discussion, environmental justice in Maryland, understanding and enforcing our human rights.
Thanks, Emily. Those are great introductions. I'm so happy you all are here. Thank you so much for being here and for using your voices to speak out against environmental injustices. You're such an amazing group of people, so inspirational, and I didn't expect much of what 2020 had to bring, but I also didn't expect to bring together you amazing folks, so thank you for being here. Before we begin, I also want to take a minute to consider the voices that aren't able to contribute tonight. I'm speaking particularly of the Piscataway Conoy tribe, whose unceded and ancestral land SMCM is located on. I want to acknowledge the land that we're on and thank the Piscataway Conoy tribe for being the first stewards of this land, but also the present and future caretakers of it. Indigenous rights are extremely important in conversations surrounding environmental human rights, and it's a mistake to historicize their struggles. While we don't have representative from the Piscataway Conoy tribe here tonight, we're so lucky to have such a diverse group of fields represented in this discussion. I'm sure that you all have encountered environmental inequality in different ways, and I'm curious to hear if there was a particular instance that you all first encountered this issue. And you all represent a very unique perspective with expertise in so many different fields. And I want to know, how has your background helped prepare you to pursue environmental equity? So whoever would like to begin, go ahead.
So I didn't know that racism was systemic until well into my adulthood. I grew up in segregation. I grew up in the 60s when it was not uncommon to see signs, even in Maryland, that indicated where whites could or could not go, or where blacks could or could not go, rather. And in those days, we actually did use a version of, the Green Book. Now people know about it because it was a movie, but my parents went to Canada and took us with my sisters and I in our VW bus in the mid-60s. And we had to navigate our way north based on where people of color could actually stay. And we ended up in a park camping ground. And there was the first time I ever heard the N-word. Someone walked into the men's room and saw me and my buddy there and said, "Oh, I didn't know they let them in this park." And I had never heard the word before. And I asked my parents what it meant. And they were incensed. And they complained to the park management, who threw us out, actually. And so many years later, people who were on that road trip with us, we had a reunion. And after all those many years later, and everyone quite remembered it the same way. They felt very self-righteous for being ejected from a park over the N-word in, I guess that was like 1963, 64, somewhere around there. But that was my first recognition that there was something different about who we were in the surrounding in the surrounding world. That was a new idea for me as a kid.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. I think that's really important to think about. Like, I don't think I was ever introduced to just the word systemic racism until I was in college. And, a lot of this group is probably college students in the St. Mary's community, but I agree that's not something that we talk about every day, but I'm happy that I think these things are being talked about more and more now.
Yeah, I'll chime in real quick. I think it's important, as Fred mentioned, to talk about, experiences. I'm from Mississippi, so I like to say real quick, I'm black man. I've been black for 45 years. I remember my first instance of racism when I was 5 years old. Racism in this country is baked into the walls of the country. If you go back to the enslaving of the African peoples, you go to Reconstruction. You got, let's go to Juneteenth. You don't even know if you're free yet in Texas, right? Then you go to Reconstruction. Hey, you can be a full citizen. You got the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. But the black codes, we want you to still be slaves, right? Then you go to the Jim Crow era, separate but equal, as Fred just talked about. Then you got new Jim Crow. We've had racism in this country since the founding of this country, the genocide of indigenous peoples to the enslaving of black folks. So my thing is, racism in America is as American as apple pie. It is America. So, it's been systemic racism. It is structural racism. So I think the problem is, our eyes have been wide shut. For some of us, as a black man, you can see that I'm black. So the thing is, I can't turn off my color. So I've been dealing with racism my whole life, right? Growing up in racist Mississippi, and I come from a community that had a landfill, that had a sewage treatment plant, that had a concrete facility, that had a major highway. My dad's a retired pipe fitter, so my father worked at a nuclear power plant. My father actually, ironically, worked at a lot of these pollution-intensive facilities that I fight against now. When I was working on the public health impacts of fracking report, which helped to ban fracking in the state of Maryland, I was in West Virginia interviewing people about the impacts of fracking in West Virginia. My dad was in a man camp building a daggum pipeline, right? So that's my experience. That's my lens. And so for me, environmental racism is connected to structural racism, right? Where you look at how we criminalize Black and brown bodies, how the murder of George Floyd, 8 minutes, 32 seconds, Arbery, the lynching of him, the shooting of somebody asleep around later, you know, the young man who got killed eating ice cream, you know, Black faces, white spaces. That is a part of America. And you can look at criminalization, you can look at how school to prison pipeline, you can look at economic apartheid in Black communities. We're talking about this COVID-19 pandemic. We're in a syndemic. We've been dealing with 400 years of racism, right? Toxic capitalism, toxic pollution, toxic viruses, and toxic climates. These things are all connected. I'll stop there because I may talk too long, so I'm gonna stop.
No, thank you, Sacoby. I think it's really important to be considering how all of these things have been here. They're not new things, and how they're impacting people today. I think that's really important. Nina, I don't know if you have any input on like how your experience in your life has brought you to fighting against environmental injustices, but if you would like to respond, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, well, I think I'm similar to Fred, sort of like on the flip side of the coin. I never really heard the word systemic racism, environmental racism, until relatively recently, but you'd have to be blind as you drive around our cities and our communities not to see the disparate conditions that, you know, different communities experience. And so, you know, from the very early ages, I'd be driving, you know, through Baltimore, New York, up in New England, and you see just the different communities. Who lives along the highways? You always wonder how these people breathe, you know, with all the highway, you know, traffic and the fumes spewing. And yet I live here in sort of bucolic Baltimore County, and you'd have to be hard-hearted, it seems to me, to grow up in a community knowing that some people live in one area where there is such environmental degradation, and other people live in an area with trees and swimming pools, and they use a tremendous amount of electricity and energy that they are not suffering the emissions from. Somebody else in a community away, you know, is suffering those emissions. And you have waste that you create, and somebody else is in fact in those communities where the waste is being thrown away, as it were, you know. So we have the privilege of feeling that their waste is away and emissions are away, and of course there is no away. We're all in this together. So it was just that growing awareness of the radical inequity, and then wondering how did that inequity come to be, because it wasn't by accident. So what policies created that inequity? And fundamentally, you know, my faith, grounded in the classic, you know, stories of the Bible and all, who say that everyone was created in God's image. We are all divine. We all have a divine spirit, and we are all equal. And so the disparity between my fundamental beliefs as all of us being fundamentally equal with fundamental dignity along with everyone else, and the disparities in the community because of some policy that was unjust, just forced me literally to quit the other work that I was doing as a rabbi, the sort of classic work I was doing as a rabbi, and jump into the environmental arena and the environmental justice arena.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. That makes a lot of sense, and I definitely see where faith can play into that, and I think that's a really important thing to think about as well for a lot of people. And you were talking about a lot of the highways, and I know that Delegate Love, I know that you have been working on some stuff with, I think, the expansion of 495.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
That's actually a great segue, because I was thinking about your question and how did I first become aware of this. And I grew up in Chicago, and it is well known in Chicago that the Eisenhower Highway was built specifically to keep the Black neighborhood away from the white neighborhood. So that sort of racism, structural and environmental, still goes on. It's something I learned early on, and it's something I'm fighting against right now. When I-495, the Washington area beltway, was built, it destroyed a community, Glen Arden, in Prince George's County. And here in my district, it destroyed an historic African-American community and actually was built in between the church and its cemetery. And now the governor is seeking to widen the highway, and we can get into this part later, but rather than fixing the injustice that was perpetrated in the 60s, they're making it worse. So, you know, it still goes on, it's still blatant, and it's just, you know, I've seen it sort of throughout my life and my career and my time at the ACLU, but to see this this church, this historic church, and to talk to some of the descendants whose ancestors were baptized in that church and are buried there, it really just hit me to the core and just disgusted me so much that I think I'm jumping up more on this issue than I have in the past.
Well, thank you so much for, you know, thank you everyone for paying attention, especially those of us who, in a way, we, you know, we're privileged enough to not have to if we don't want to. So I want to thank you. I'm sorry to phrase it in that way, but I think that's the reality of it for a lot of people. So yeah, thank you guys for paying attention and for working for the good for everyone. And Senator Washington, thanks so much for joining us. I would love to hear, yeah, Sacoby just put in the chat that Baltimore was the first city in the country that had racism-based zoning. And we are going to get into this a little bit later, but we can jump into it now. If you have anything to say about that.
Well, again, it's interesting. I was a little delayed in part because I was on a meeting with the community about dealing with some open space, protection of open space that potentially has a kind of racial component in that there's a developer, somebody bought the property, and there's just a lot of stuff. So there's always all kinds of things. So hello, State Senator Mary Washington. Mr. Wilson, it's good to follow behind you. Ms. Cardin, it's good to follow behind you. I think it's really, it was really poignant and important when we're starting these calls, we're recognizing the land that we're on. So thank you very much for starting that way. You know, I have a little, I guess I want to pull back. You asked why do I care and why I'm committed to environmental justice. It's in part because I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up in a place that had a large park. I grew up in the opportunity with my dad, very much loved the outdoors. And we would go for hikes and walks in the park. He played tennis and we would wander around in that space and have an opportunity to do it. And of course, over time, seeing the degradation of those urban-based green spaces. And then on top of that, as an adult, learning about the environmental justice as and equity as being something that is not only fighting for green space and fighting for opportunities for outdoor recreation, supporting greening projects and things, but also making sure that Black and brown people aren't being experimented upon and are not being exposed to environmental toxins. And I wanted to just introduce, as a part of our discussion, maybe that the EPA actually has a definition of environmental justice that I've been sort of working on and also trying to resonate with the fact that they have this great definition. The fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all persons, regardless of race, color, natural origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulation, and policies. And again, this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys, one, the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazard, and equal access to the decision-making process to a healthy environment in which we live, learn, and work. So what I look forward to in this discussion and all discussions is both the fight to protect the lungs and the bodies of Black and brown people from environmental toxins, but also to build up and enhance and create participation in the creation of healthy environments, but also supporting of these. And I think it's important that in the context and the defense of Black lives and in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, that it's really, really critical that we focus and recognize these toxins and harms to communities and recognize that they've been exposed, as was mentioned earlier, that it's been done purposefully, that this is not, it was not an accident, and that we have the opportunity and the responsibility now to alleviate the public risks that our communities are having. And so supporting all kinds of programs and doing some of the things that Delegate Love is committed to do, but making sure that we have this inclusive movement that supports Black Lives Matter as a movement for racial and economic justice, and also making sure that when inside of all of our communities that are on the environmental side, that we're also making sure we're having that dialogue. So why am I here? I love the outdoors. I grew up that way. It's healthy. It reminds me, it's just a good space to be, particularly in these difficult times, but also it's just a matter of life and death.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Washington. That was great. It definitely, yeah, it's a matter of life and death. And it's amazing. It's amazing to see people like using outdoor spaces at seriously record numbers right now. And I feel like spaces are, I mean, with the Black Lives Matter movement and, you know, with the pandemic, there's really been a big push towards inclusivity in outdoor spaces. So that's definitely been like something that I'm really excited about because I'm particularly interested in the outdoor industry, I guess. But I also have another question for you all. And this is like a segue from, we're thinking about like, toxins and harms that certain communities are being exposed to. And I just wanted to know if you all could speak on what you see to be one of the most threatening environmental challenges in Maryland. So Delegate Love, if you want to start.
Sure. I was trying to think about one and I couldn't. I came up with three, actually. One, not surprisingly, is development, increased development, just, you know, the highways that I was talking about. And then I may be aware of what Senator Washington was talking about. There's development that's going in East Howson and will rip out their forest buffer and their wetlands. So they have this beautiful green space in this historic neighborhood that was built by slaves that over the years development has winnowed down, and they still have this beautiful park and this beautiful forest that's going to be taken out by development. So I think development is a huge problem. Plastics actually are also a huge problem, from waste to the toxins that they emit in the water. So you look around our state, and I know our Waterkeeper certainly can address that, but it's a real environmental problem in Maryland. And then the last, I would talk a little bit more about water and the chemicals that are being released into our waters, anything from, you know, lead to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So water is another big environmental problem in Maryland.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. And I think as a follow-up to that question, and maybe Senator Washington, if you want to be the next responder. So when we're thinking about some of the most threatening environmental challenges in Maryland, I think it's also important to think about how the current administration is responding to some of these issues and how it may have made it more difficult to respond to some of these challenges just because of the ways that activism is being seen right now and some of the ways that science is being seen right now. So I'd love to hear you speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is our academic institutions, for example, and our scientists, right, and having the ability to actually speak out against environmental injustice and the practices of the federal government without being fearful of losing their funding or losing their jobs. So I do think just the ability, one of the most threatening environmental challenges is the ability to fight it and to speak out against it. We do have pollution and corporate practices that really threaten all of our public resources. And so I think the air quality, in Baltimore, needing to fight against, the burning incinerators. I'm thinking of, the call for social justice and racial justice has been "I can't breathe," and that this is literally what our communities have been living with for decades. Disproportionate impacts on dirty air, of all kinds of diseases, respiratory diseases, that these are things that low-income communities are facing, higher risks of cancer because of air pollutants. So for me, I guess there's the threat to the democracy and the science and being able to speak out against it. And then two, the higher cancer risks from hazardous air pollutants and toxic emissions. I see those as two, and this, essentially the deregulation of the fossil fuel industry is going to disproportionately impact people of color and low-income communities in Maryland.
Yeah,
I don't know, Maryland, there's a fact I guess I wanted to share is that Maryland is 5th in the country for the highest deaths from air pollution, that are related somehow to respiratory, that it can be directly impacted to non-point source air pollution. And that is something we have to address.
I didn't know that, and that's really disturbing. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Dr. Wilson, I'd like to hear what you think about that, especially because you have a background in science, and I'd like to hear you speak a little bit on the role that citizen science can play in a time like this.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, as Senator just mentioned, air pollution is a huge issue. So I think the term we like to use, we call it traffic-related air pollution, TRAP. So TRAP, particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, nitrogen oxide, so NOx, sulfur oxide, so SOx. So those remember NOx and SOx, got SOx on, knock on the door. So those, you think about traffic-related air pollution. You got folks, as she said, high mortality rates. You got particulate matter, 2.5 microns. It causes asthma attacks, elevates your blood pressure, causes heart disease, causes strokes, causes Alzheimer's, causes diabetes, infant mortality, birth defects, low birth weight births, causes cancer, right? Premature mortality, and also impacts life expectancy. That's only one pollutant. And, well, hey, in this area, you're in attainment with the standard. Just because you're in attainment with the National Ambient Air Quality Standard doesn't mean you don't have health impacts. There's no safe level of particulate matter. There's no safe level of lead. And one of the things I like to say when it comes to air pollution issues, right, and thinking about children, how you gonna put America first, y'all, if you don't put your children first? We have too many children of color living in toxic environments. You're putting a cap on their potential, right? So you think about this point that Senator made about science. There's been an erosion of science, partly because we have an anti-science administration, also because too many scientists don't do action science. Don't communicate science well. Too many scientists are studying the problem, doing extractive science, doing pain pipping science, and not doing action science, not doing applied science, not doing problem solving science, not doing science for social justice, not doing science for social change, right? That's part of the problem. So you gotta make science every day. You gotta make science proximal. You gotta make science pocketbook. Connect science to food, faith, family, health, and jobs. If everybody was doing science, if science was more inclusive, you should. The fact we got few people of color still as scientists, right? We have less than 5% black faculty at the University of Maryland. I'm gonna say that again. Less than 5% in a county that's 6% black. Around Washington, D.C. area, there's over 40% people of color. What is that? That means intentional lack of effort to create pipelines and retain faculty of color. That's just one example, part of the problem. Historically black colleges in 2015 received less than 3% of research dollars that the federal funding sources provide. Less than 3%. Look at how many historically black colleges we have in this state. Coppin, right? We got Morgan, right? We got Bowie. I live in Bowie. I live 5 minutes from Bowie State. So there's a lot of on the science side. Now, again, on the citizen science side, You don't have to be a PhD, have a PhD to be a scientist. It could be a scientist. For me, the folks that are most impacted from the front line and fence line communities should be driving science. One of my community mentors told me, like, Sacoby, I live in this community, impacted by these issues of power plants or landfills and incinerators. We are the true subject matter experts. So citizen science is a way to make sure you make science more actionable, and the folks that are most impacted are driving that science, and that means you're getting science that can actually lead to real change. I'll stop there because I talk about this stuff every day, but
That was great.
I'm gonna stop. Okay.
You don't have to stop. It's awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's interesting thinking about, like, you know, science, it's weird because I feel like lately science is like up for interpretation and however you want to interpret it. And as a citizen scientist, you're going to interpret the science as how something affects you. And I think that's how it should be interpreted. And I think that, you know, if people are doing science, like citizen science, and you're interpreting in the right way, that will lead to activism. So I totally agree with.
Yeah, but we use science every day. We're watching science right now. We are science. We eat science. We live, we turn science on and off. We drive science. We breathe science. Some of that science is bad science, right? Pollution. So we got to increase scientific literacy, and we have to do a better job of science communication too. Making science, again, proximal. I think and bringing science to the people and doing science for the people.
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I completely agree. Science is all over. It's just what you're going to view as being science or not, and how important you want science to be for your life, even though it impacts you every second of every day.
Exactly.
And Dr. Wilson is right in that, if you don't mind, if we're just having a conversation, that, you know, the communicating our ideas, right? And you can do really great things, but if you're not able to translate that. So I just wonder, how do we do it? I mean, Dr. Wilson, you're really good at communicating these complicated issues. So what can academic institutions do to create scientists that are able to, or whoever, or activist communities get more of the scientific understanding, so that when they can come together and communicate effectively and competently and inspire critical thinking in these matters? Like, what do you?
I'll be real quick. I think part of it is, to answer the question, I think that's a great question. We need to fund more science communication. A lot of folks don't learn it when they get, whether they've been in the undergraduate program or in their graduate programs. You don't learn how to do good science communication. I'm the editor-in-chief of environmental justice, right? Publication is important, but that's not, to me, science communication. That's for me. That's not helping the people out. Science communication was an infographic, a blog, a sign-on letter, right? A policy brief, a white paper, a tweet, Facebook posts, TikToking. You know, that's what you get. Science communication and technology and modality people understand and get. That's important. Also, what's important is we got to make sure that NSF, NIH are funding more what we're talking about. But we have a lot of discovery science. We know what people are being impacted by. We got to fund action science, intervention science, and evaluation science, right? And I think I call it, and I'll stop here. I'll try to stop here. I call it, let's take more of like a taxpayer's approach to science. Taxpayer science. If you actually had to be responsible to the taxpayers, science will be totally different. It'd be less on discovery, more on engagement and action and real change. A lot of science right now is just studying problems. We have plenty of data. How we translate the data to action. And that's why citizen science is important, because it focuses on action. That's why community-driven research is important, because it focuses on action. So, and also just, I'll end here, investing more in STEM, I think is important, and bringing STEM into K-12, whether it be parochial or non-parochial schools, that's low-hanging fruit. All kids love science. It's just we're creating opportunity structures for them to be scientists. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I just want to suggest also Micah has a wonderful School of Social Design, and what might be fascinating is actually to create these programs where the students of the School of Social Design work with the scientists to create those community communications projects. And I think you're right. I mean, that could, to bring the artists and the designers and the storytellers and the communicators into conversation with the scientists to create the stories that could be told. That could be an exciting project and program. So maybe you're already doing that. But But I also wanted to say one of my favorite sort of tropes coming from an academic world, because I used to work in an academic administration, is that essentially all research is really autobiography. People research and write about largely things that move them and that they're familiar with, which is why, Dr. Wilson, when you say we have to get more people of color into the sciences, they will bring the questions with them that this community needs to have answered. And so it's the autobiography of the researchers truly affects the results, the questions and the results that science provides us. And so if we have a primarily white research academic community, that's going to have different questions and therefore different answers. And so you're absolutely right. We need to make sure that we can broaden that community. And so just go a little bit further. What are the primary challenges that we see in this environmental arena? One, I think it is an extension of what we just said. We need to continue to reach and engage those people who are involved in these questions, right? Those people who are involved in communities that are impacted. We have to make sure that they are involved from the very, very beginning, not at the end as responders or reactors to some design that has been proposed, but from the very, very beginning to engage people who are part of that community, the initiatives, the designs from the very, very start. And we have to make sure also that we're not worrying so much about, and there's a question I know on the chat, how do we get rid of waste? But we have to go back to the very, very beginning of design of products, design of packaging, right? Design of the stuff that makes life livable. At the very, very beginning, from the time of the imagination and the human brain, how do we design it so that it has an end of life that is regenerative and not going to sit in some sort of landfill someplace? So again, it's sort of about engaging people with imagination who can answer new questions and provide new approaches to these questions. Just two other quick things. We do have an excess of consumption. I know that consumption drives the economy. And one of the things we have to do is reconnect again a healthy environment with a healthy economy. Because right now, too many people are saying, oh my gosh, if you worry about the environment, you're going to crash the economy. Well, that's certainly not the case. There can be no healthy economy without a healthy environment. So we have to make sure we reconnect those two. But at the same time, we have to make sure that our consumption is appropriate, right? We don't have wasteful consumption. There's so many people who need so many things. We don't have to create things that are wasteful. We have to create things that are very useful. And as we say, have at the end of their usable life a way to be regenerative. And one of the biggest areas of environmental concern is food. How food is grown, how food is transported, how much of it is eaten, how it is discarded. I keep thinking of food waste as sort of our 21st century Dust Bowl. I mean, the amount of water and topsoil and fossil fuels that are wasted because food gets wasted is just astonishing, right? When you waste food, you waste all of those resources that went into it. So we have to worry about how we create the food, the people, and the health of the people who grow our food and package our food and fish and create the products of the food. All those people also have to be taken into consideration, and their health have to be taken into consideration. So food, the whole entire industry of food is a huge industry we have to look at.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. I totally agree. I'm really passionate actually about food waste. My senior thesis was all about, it was kind of an anti-capitalist argument for community food growing, I guess, and distribution. But yeah, you were talking earlier about the program at MICA and just trying to get more people and more voices involved in things like this. And my next question is similar, because I want to know why intersectionality, so things like gender, race, religion, and age within environmentalism is so important, and what does it mean to be an ally in the fight for environmental justice? So Delegate Love, if you want to respond to that one.
Sure. I mean, I think everything that we've just been talking about is the reason why we need all voices in this. Because, you know, Nina, you and I can't solve all the problems because we won't know all of the problems. We sit in a very different position than people who are in, you know, the areas that are being poisoned, their air and their water. So we have to have all voices, and those who are in positions to lift up voices of people, to make sure that their voices are being heard, those who are being affected by environmental injustices and toxins and all of that.
Right, thank you. And I feel like, you know, being in a position where you're having to amplify the voices of others is a really important thing to think about, where, you know, you all have really extremely important leadership roles, and so many people are inspired by you, and we're thinking about how you can be involved as an ally, and you're tasked with speaking for others, which is really, is it speaking for others or is it amplifying other voices?
Yeah, I see it as amplifying other voices. I cannot speak for people who have had certain experiences because I haven't had them.
Right.
So I see my job as amplifying their voice and bringing their voice forward.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm sure so many folks appreciate that too. How have you learned to coordinate with that, Nina? How have you learned to amplify a voice rather than speak for someone else?
With great humility. It is hard. Perhaps one of the best ways to say it, which is a somewhat uncomfortable way of saying it, but I think it is true, and I think Delegate Love certainly understands this too. For those of us who have the privilege of, in fact, having space, right, being given the opportunity to claim a space in the public arena, right, to own that, what we need to do then is to move out of it, you know, and let others move into it. Hold that space so that it's not occupied by somebody else who, you know, is usurping it. But hold that space so that others can, you know, absolutely move in. My sense of what this environmental human rights amendment that I'm fighting for is all about is precisely that. The amendment is a space holder. It is a legal space holder for those people who are negatively impacted by environmental degradation. And it gives them the legal right to claim that they should no longer be oppressed by environmental racism, by environmental degradation. It gives them that legal space that they do not now have as a matter of right. And so what I want to do is just know that I have a privilege to be able to say things and claim a space, and then recognize that my job is to get out of the way and to cede the floor to those who otherwise might have to fight to gain that floor.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was really important to talk about. And it's hard to try to navigate a space. And I think it's really a thing that people, as you said, to take it with great humility, but I think it's a thing that people with privilege really have to learn how to navigate. Because, you know, there's a difference between at least acknowledging these things that are happening, and there's a difference between trying to speak for the experience of others. So thank you for that advice. And you were talking about like being brought up.
Could I add something around this and the sort of the tensions within our various communities? And so, you know, I recognize that when I started it, I was, and I started to talk about, I was going to come from a place of relative privilege in that I had an opportunity to play in a park and we played tennis and et cetera. And I think to make sure that in the context of this discussion around it, it's not the case that that there's a dichotomy that's real around environmental justice in terms of environmental hazards. But I think there still is a little bit of an assumption that Black and brown people aren't as interested in parks and aren't interested in green space, and that it's tree huggers are white. And then if we're going to talk about the environment, we do need to talk about those, I love this, food, faith, health, jobs, like that is real. And that certainly is how to talk about it in community colors, but that's also how to talk about it, more broadly. But there is, I think we do have to recognize that there's variation within all of our groups, and to not sort of recreate, even in these discussions about racism and allyship, privileging the voices of allies in this conversation. So I just wanted to call that out. We can make sure that I think there's some discourse that's talking about, since there's so much attention to climate change, there are those that are saying, oh, look, the environmental justice is just trying to co-opt climate change, and move, and we shouldn't be talking about police brutality and incinerators, we'd be talking about carbon caps and all of these other things. And so I think that there's a danger, and we need to make sure that we don't allow our struggle for a clean planet, clean air, healthy citizens to get co-opted by any, that there can be pushback on both sides, and we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah, let me jump in on that point. You can't have climate justice without environmental justice. As someone who's been in this space since I was an undergrad, since 1995. And so I think part of the issue in the state of Maryland is the fact that you have two commissions. And just as a FYI, I think Delegate Love knows this, Senator Washington know this. I was part of a group that submitted a letter to the governor, asking the governor, what are you doing about racism in the state? And part of that letter, we got on MDE, about MDE's role in advancing environmental justice. MDE doesn't have an EJ plan. In that letter, we talked about the fact that you have the EJ Commission, which has been around for over 20 years. Glenn has done nothing to advance environmental justice, but you have a new Climate Change Commission that's more funded, that's better staffed. So Climate Change Commission has been prioritized of environmental justice, but you can't deal with climate change without dealing with environmental justice. It should be one committee. It should be the Climate and Environmental Justice Committee, in the same way NAACP, which is headquartered in Baltimore, has the Climate and Environmental Justice Program headed by Jackie Patterson. Who are the people going to be most impacted by natural, biological, and chemical disasters? It's the same folks, right? Climate change is going to disproportionately impact frontline and fence line communities. It's not just greenhouse gases, it's co-pollutants, urban heat island, partly due to segregation and redlining, right? Coastal flooding. Think of what's happened with CAFOs. If you go issue to issue when it comes to climate change, you got to talk about equity and justice. So the fact that we have this inequities in our state shows that we prioritize, basically people with privilege when it comes to climate change, and not looking at those who are most vulnerable or differentially impacted by climate change. So I think that's important, and that's one of the things, my issues I did say earlier. A big issue in the state is climate change in all this form: coastal flooding, sunny day flooding, Ellicott City flooding, stormwater issues, urban heat island, heat stress, power plants in Brandywine. I'm gonna let Fred talk. Fred can jump in this too, but we gotta have that central focus about equity and justice, right? So I'll stop because I can hear myself talking too much, but I'm gonna pass the mic.
It's all good.
I don't think you're talking too much. Again, it's great, and this is stuff that I don't think everyone knows about, and people need to know about it. So thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about also the role. And we're talking about white spaces versus Black spaces. And I have a question for Fred. Sorry, you just joined us again, so I don't want to bombard you with a question, but I'm going to do it anyway. So you're the only African-American waterkeeper in the entire country. And the marginalized groups face barriers to outdoor recreation. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that inclusion in outdoor spaces is an issue of environmental justice? And what do you think some of the biggest barriers of inclusion in outdoor spaces are?
Wow, what a deep well. So I've been a compulsive outdoor guy for most of my lifetime. In fact, in my old career, that's actually why I worked, was to be able to afford to travel to interesting places and go hiking and backpacking and kayaking. When I became a riverkeeper, that now became less affordable, but It also, like I said earlier, alluded to earlier, I didn't have much of an awareness when I started this work of the systemic side of race. In fact, or racism, it didn't really occur to me that it was anything other than something that was isolated and here and there. I now think there's a sense of domain attached to environmental cause movements that whites often have. The presumption is that we started these places and we know what there is to know about the environment, and we're looking to get people involved with these movements that really belong to us because we've been the people that have been doing all of this work. And to the extent that people of color haven't participated, I think there's a presumption that means they're not interested, which is an irony, right? If they don't embrace the leadership that's there, the presumption is they couldn't possibly be in the environment. Otherwise, they'd be doing the same stuff that we're doing. I actually think that, like fingerprints, environmentalism, activism is something very unique and personal. We all have different ways of expressing that, culturally, individually, and so on. So I don't believe it's easy for people of color to be ourselves in these movements where there's an expectation that we are diversity, we're predefined by the time we arrive, and that's a tough one, diversity, because I don't think diversity and equality are the same thing. Actually, diversity is a label hard to shake. Once you're in the picture as diversity, it's like, wow, I guess I better act diverse or something, right? I mean, it doesn't really set the stage for meaningful participation as long as we're labeled and prejudged and evaluated on standards that don't apply to us. So I have fought most of my life, and more particularly so, I think, as a Riverkeeper, to be my own man, frankly. To think as I think, do as I do, interact with communities on my own basis. And mind you, the expectations of me as a person of color in these communities is very different than they would be if I were a white Riverkeeper, because Black communities think I'm their Riverkeeper, regardless of what watershed we're in. The presumption is that I get it. And so I better get it. Right? And so I've had to really play catch up because I'm a late comer to the realization that race is a barrier for us in terms of our ability to work together. The cultural competence that we all have for interacting with each other could use a lot of tuning up, because we got to get together on this stuff. We really aren't going to fix these resources, one ethnic group or one interest group, all by our lonesome, while the others stand by and applaud and send money. That's ridiculous. These have to be movements that are substantially connective. And what better subject matter than water, air, land? I mean, the environment, like we're an aquarium, if we were fish in an aquarium, that would be our domain. So I do believe this is the real work, and it takes a certain people sense. It's not about science, it's about people and how you interact with people in communities, what ethical basis you use to interact with those communities. So maybe I'll stop there, but if that kind of maps the terrain, there's a lot we could talk about within that frame. But the bottom line is, these are difficult, challenging organizations, I think, for people of color to participate in sometimes, not because of the aims. People keep telling me, oh, we all want the same thing, so what difference does it make? Actually, we're very nuanced in terms of how we want what we want and how we intend to get there and the relative power that we can bring to the table to achieve those things. Yeah. I hope that helps.
Can I chime in what Fred said? I've been in Maryland since 2011. And Fred knows, we talked about this a lot. My experience has been, a lot of the green groups in the region and the funders, they focus just on the conservation of the bay. Mm-hmm. But they haven't talked about biological diversity outside of non-human species. You got folks who trying to, living in our communities who are being left behind. Mm-hmm. So you should, prioritize, one over the other, but there needs to be more of an integrated, more holistic, like for those of you, the One Health approach, right? One Health approach, or more inclusive movement. So the EJ issues, the EJ groups, so these groups, these issues around moral issues around environmental movement, they've been kind of left to the side. And the funders, are part of that, right? Funding plays a role because a lot of EJ groups don't have capacity, right? Leadership capacity, individual capacity leads to leadership capacity, leads to organizational capacity, leads to programmatic capacity, leads to translation of that work to having some impact. You have people struggling to maintain capacity. What are they going to be able to do? And so there's a lot of privilege right around that. A lot of privilege. I mean, I have class privilege, and I recognize that. I live in Bowie. I always say I don't live in the EJ community. I got a little bit of traffic. I live in a food oasis. I have 8 grocery stores in 2-mile radius of my house. You go to Bladensburg, it's the opposite. You go to Langley Park, it's the opposite, right? You go to Baltimore, it's the opposite. So I think these issues are really, as Fred said, we got to change not just I mentioned the cultural academia in the chat. We got to change the culture of our green movement within this region.
Mm-hmm.
Be more inclusive. And Fred, you're exactly right, because diversity, this is an old school term for y'all. I call it like video game coinage. What is that? Token. I don't like being a token. I mean, I'm a token at University of Maryland. It's not just green, y'all. I know I'm talking. I can hear myself. I need to come to a closing point. It's just not the green movement. It's academia too. You heard me say it's the same stuff. Whose knowledge counts, right? Whose issues count? Who's leading the movement? Whose voices count? That's why environmental justice is really important. It's about community self-determination, speak with their own voices. And we just need to create that space for folks to speak with their own voices. And Fred, right, if we can do that, we can move forward. But as I said, these issues are all connected. And so we have to be holistic, because we've been inefficient, y'all. We're looking at this issue and forgetting that, hey, this system is connected to all these issues. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Well, I think Mr. Tutman is right, and I prior to coming here, I read your history, and I again just amazed by it, and also with the Environmental Justice Commission. I remember about 15 years ago, I started going to their meetings before I was a delegate, and you're absolutely right. There's this segregation and this apartheid, which is really what it is when it comes to looking at environmental issues. And so, looking at our history and recognizing residential segregation and economic inequality and overlaying that into the so-called environmental movement or to the climate change movement, and to thinking what are the discriminatory practices. So I know there are students and faculty that are on this Zoom meeting, and I think when we look at your classes that you're teaching, when you're looking at your organizations, we can look inside, and again, some of us are coming from, there's privilege, like when I'm working with young people, I have to recognize my age privilege and I have to step back a little bit, but I can't just step back and not sort of do anything else. So it's about really evaluating what are the practices and ways of knowing and being that are perpetuating what you are trying to dismantle. So it's not simply to, as you said, grab a token and have somebody speak on the panel. I'm going to tell you, I've been asked to speak on so many panels from all over the country of people I don't even know. And I'm sure what's happening is like, hey, do you know Black PhD? Or, hey, do you know? And so now all of a sudden I'm on a panel, it's me and a bunch of other people that don't look like anything like me. And I appreciate the effort in some way, but then does that then translate to when the next hire comes up, when there's students that are being encouraged to move forward. So as students, I'm going to speak to, demand that change and don't reproduce sort of the discriminatory, exclusionary practices that you see operating all around and resulted in the world in which we're currently living in. I know you can do it better. You know so much more than I did when I was your age. You're being exposed to, and I'm sorry for what all you're being exposed to that our generations and generations before you created. But in some ways, you're not going to be as blind as some of us were, sort of as we were moving along and thinking that it's just about merit, it's just about working hard, it's just about doing the right thing, and not recognizing that there are practices that have the intention to be discriminatory. So with that, I'll stop.
Yeah, well, thank you for squeezing us into your busy schedule of panels.
You're home. No, this is different. This is Maryland. This is family. Like I'll speak at every school in Maryland, but literally getting calls from other places, and it's like, oh.
No, I get it. And these are your constituents, and these are the people that need to hear it in the state. So, but thank you again. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you
all get it. Don't feel bad. You all, everybody here, you all, this is, but it was just more of a point about what, I guess the larger point was not just surface change, something for optics. So as being ally, or what I would call for in your allyship, is not just about the optics, which are important. Do the optics. You look at a panel and it all looks the same. Yes, do something about that, but also look underneath to see, okay, what are the practices within the institution that put it in a position where that is the way it is. That's the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll take time. Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. And it's nice to have this conversation as well at like an institute of higher learning, because I'm hoping that the students that are in this talk tonight are going to take something out of it, and then they'll want to stay here and make Maryland better. And I think that leads us also to thinking about just like community-based and grassroots activism and that movement. And considering that, I'm curious to know what the relationship between the government and grassroots movements and community-based movements is. And what role do you guys think that the government should play in the fight for environmental justice? And where does that leave community-based activism and the grassroots movement? So Delegate Love, if you have something to say, I'd like to hear from you.
Sure. Well, I come from a place of activism, so I appreciate, value, love, and respect activists, and I think they play a huge role. I think you can't have good government without activists, because one of the things that I've found being on the legislator side is that we also have to be generalists. So we need the activists who really know the issue, know the space that they live in, know their community, to have that knowledge and that passion and that information, and to bring it to the government so that the elected officials can make the changes that need to be made in the laws. And I think as elected officials, we really need to listen to activist groups and community groups and respect their voices and their histories and knowledge, and listen to them as to what the solution should be. I mean, when I was an activist, one of the most frustrating things to me was I would spend inordinate amount of time on an issue, and then legislators would rip it apart. And I'm like, okay, you don't know what you're talking about. And it used to drive me crazy. And so now as a legislator, I work very hard at making sure that before I make changes to a bill, yes, it's my bill because I'm the legislator, but that I'm learning from the subject matter experts, those community folks, those community activists.
Can I jump in real quick? As a follow-up. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of opportunities for government officials to collaborate with community folk. I would say on the front end, though, as we mentioned in the chat and in previous points, that Delegate Love and Senator, Delegate Washington, what they mentioned, government has played a role in creating environmental injustice. So if you go back again, redlining, I put in FHA. The Delegate Love mentioned highways, the National Highway Defense Act, built highways to Black and brown communities, disinvestment and divestment, even local decisions around, like some of the most important decisions around zoning, right? And Fred knows this, and Prince George's County Zoning Board has so much power, or the permitting agency. I put in the chat state section poisoning of communities. Why are we permitting poison? Why are we permitting facilities to emit pollution? Just that idea that you have the right to pollute. That makes no sense. That's anti-health. That's not even moral, right? That's anti-planet Earth. That's anti-everything we stand for as people. I like to talk about I shared hope, I shared values, I shared love, I shared family, right? And so I think getting back to the positive side, there's a lot of work we can do together. We just had a legislative work group session 2 months ago where we had activists and advocates and delegates like Delegate Love, Delegate Charkudian, Delegate Hidalgo, Delegate Ivy had a rep for activists and advocates to work together to work on bills. So we talked about cumulative impacts bill, we talked about carbon pricing bills, we talked about the Healthy Community Air Act bill, that's the KFOS, air quality monitoring bill. We talked about multiple energy-related bills, right? Renewable bills. So I think that's a good way for us to work together to build and grow and have impact. And then on next Thursday, whatever the 5th is, we're going to have the caucuses, the Progressive Caucus, Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, the Latino Caucus, and the Black Caucus are having a series of discussions. And the first discussion, I think, in our series on the 5th is going to be on environmental justice. So there's things that are happening. So I think I respect and value and I appreciate the leadership of Senator Washington, Delegate Love, and all the other delegates, because I think this is how we can move forward, because they're bringing that equity and justice lens to the work, and we need that inside. And I'll stop there.
Every time I go to Baltimore Harbor, I stand there on the waterfront and I look around me and I look at the dead fish and I look at all this pollution going on, and I realize that everything I can see has a government permit. Everything. Mm-hmm. All right? Mm-hmm. There's a dual role that government plays in this. And the Patuxent has a rather extraordinary history with this. A lot of people don't remember or don't know, but the origin of the Bay movement came from the Patuxent. After years in the 60s and 70s of filing lawsuits, right, and Governor Harry Hughes came into office, right, because they wanted to settle these lawsuits. They were sick of the Patuxent citizens suing the state over the lack of enforcement. And so they basically came up with a series of reforms adjudicated by Judge Sirica, incidentally, of Watergate fame. They locked everybody in a nunnery, I'm not kidding. And they came up with a solution for protecting the Patuxent, but they couldn't get it passed in the General Assembly because nobody cared about the Patuxent except the people who lived there, who fished there, who had some connection to it. And so Hughes said, let's start a Chesapeake Bay program, then everybody will have a seat at the table. Next thing you know, you've got this massive cleanup effort that has basically been, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but it's not winning. Okay, 40 years later, right? This movement has become so diffuse. We haven't saved a single river. We can't see the forest for the trees. We can't see a single tributary for the entire bay. So I think the government is integral to this, and government can set the stage, but government is not a solution. Really, squeaky wheels like citizens make all the difference in the world. And part of the work that we do in planting these seeds of activism, right, along the Patuxent River, connecting these communities that all have local concerns, but they're unified, embodied within this whole river, that is extraordinary work, I think, because it will outlive us. It doesn't depend on grants, it depends on citizen passion. And that, to me, is the work that we really need to be doing, is paying it forward to make sure that these movements don't die when the grants run out, but that people keep struggling in order to bring this about. And, government obviously has a big role to play, but it doesn't play that role well unless citizens are kicking its butt. It's that serious. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but that's the reality.
That's so true, but it is also so difficult, as we were talking about before, for many, not just citizens, but for residents who are here to participate in government. I'm hoping in some way that us all learning how to participate in these Zoom calls and conferences provides a greater democratization of the engagement of people in government. It is so hard for many people to feel that they have the confidence and the ability to speak to their representatives. They might call and write, they might not always get the responses that they want. Obviously, present company excluded. You guys, Mary, you just were saying you were late because you were doing constituent work. Yay, that's what we want you to do. Most people, by the way, think more that you guys do more about law than constituent work. And many of the delegates and senators that I know are saying they're spending more of their time on constituent work than on the laws, which is wonderful. But not everybody knows that, and they don't come to you, nor can they spend a day to come to Annapolis, to wait all day to speak for 2 minutes, for a bill. And I'm hoping that somehow, both in this coming session, but also in the future, there is a way to make it easier for constituents and citizens and residents to participate in it. Because, Fred, you're absolutely right. It is the squeaky wheel. It is getting activists engaged. But how can people do that when they are so consumed with the everyday aspects of just living? And so government somehow has to help engage with activists, residents, just the citizens, your constituents in a way. And I know it's unfair to say that because you're running as fast as you can too, but somehow we have to make the communication between constituents and residents and just folks who are living here and government officials easier, because right now, it is very difficult for so many who want to engage but can't.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. And Dr. Wilson was totally right that there really isn't enough time to ask all the questions. And I wish I had an hour and a half with each of you. But that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Atlas to field some questions from the audience. So Atlas, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Maddie. Just a quick introduction of myself. My name is Atlas Jackmon. I am a senior here at St. Mary's College in Maryland. I am studying environmental studies and Asian studies. So we have a few questions in the chat. I'm going to sort of mesh two of them together because they're both about the incinerator in Baltimore. So the first question is from Jonathan Shea about the Baltimore's push to become zero waste, yet not decommissioning the Bresco incinerator. So firstly, what are your thoughts on that? And then sort of to continue on that, there was another question about it, basically how there are pros and cons of decommissioning it and leaving it, especially the electricity and steam power that's created from using it. So basically, Jonathan and this other student are asking, what do you think is the best mode to go forward with this? And this is a question open to anyone.
Well, since it's Baltimore, I'll just say just quickly, certainly my position is that Bresco incinerator poisons families and communities, and that there has been that right now we have our current mayor is not acting. So hopefully once our new mayor comes on, we can do something about it. But unfortunately, the current plan of this current administration is to lock Baltimore into the use of the trash incinerator at least for another decade. That again is a fight that's continuing that will continue to be fought by communities. We know that it's poisoning people. The Wheelabrator has admitted to the fact that it really can't burn trash safely. So what do I think about it? That we've got to figure out how to undo this attempt to extend it for another 10 years, to kick the can down the road, and that hopefully the next administration will be inclined to do something about it. I know that the council wanted to, and I know that even the courts were heading in the right direction. But this latest, as of I think about a couple of weeks ago, has really set the effort back.
I'm gonna jump in real quick on that. I agree 100%. That state sanctioned poison I said before. Incinerators you got to do a true cost accounting. It's the environmental externalities, the health externalities, social externalities, and health externalities. That's been pushed out on the local folks. So if you actually look at the true impact, you're not even doing if you want to put in monetary value, lives lost, loss of life expectancy, loss of income. You can go on and on to make a case against the incinerator. So it should be shut down. We need to think about zero waste, right? Zero waste initiatives. And also, we had a conversation in a meeting earlier today about the power in the mayor. The mayor has more power than the council. So if you get a new mayor that's more supportive of shutting it down, then that's the way to move forward with a different approach. And then with Delegate Charkoudian's work around renewables, we need to invest. Communities of color need renewables. You can have a whole economic opportunity structure built around renewables. So you don't have to burn the trash, do zero waste, more jobs, right? Less pollution, less impacts. Bring in renewables, more jobs. Bring in solar power, more jobs. Bring in electrification, more jobs. Bring in geothermal, more jobs. Building the panels, more jobs. That's thinking out of the box, and they deserve that. They've earned that. They need that. So I'll stop.
Well, I'll just follow both of those. That one of the work groups that I've been working on has been taking a look at recycling and trash across the entire state. And yes, we have to close Bresco. I mean, there's just no question about it. The next question is, then what happens to the trash? So we have to have that solution ready to go. And, it's all tied into, I think Dr. Wilson posted about fossil fuels and, the oil companies pumping in more plastics into our economy. So we've got to put some of the responsibility to stop making those on them. We've got to come up with better food composting. All of these will get us down towards zero waste. So that can help support closing Bresco, but we, hands down, the senator's right. We've got to close that. And then there are all these other things that we have to do.
Okay, thank you all for answering that one. Real quick, I do have a few questions that I've written as well. Firstly, Dr. Wilson mentioned gentrification as an environmental justice issue. Could the homelessness crisis in Baltimore also be considered an environmental justice issue in the realm of land and resource use? And how can we go about remedying the problems through an environmental justice lens? Yeah,
I think when you think about the homeless population, and I think we have to invest more in the helping people, right? So sometimes we have a tendency to put our homeless shelters in places where we already have environmental hazards, right? So it's like one of the things about environmental injustice, we don't see the humanity of people. The fact that we have the high rate of homelessness in Baltimore, we're not seeing their humanity. If we invest in more, in people more, you can see a change. For example, folks may have different things about the whole shut down the police and divest the police. I think the point is, don't get bogged down by the slogan. Invest in communities. Invest in social services. All these people you see murdered, just another Black man got murdered. He was having a mental health issue. Invest in mental health services, right? Invest in economic opportunity structures. Invest in people get jobs for living wages. I mean, if we invest in community and people more, you reduce the rate of homelessness. You reduce the number of suicides, right? You will reduce the number of people who are being forgotten, that we made invisible, right? So that to me is where we need to change. And so the town council, the Baltimore council, and the mayor having a program to actually do more community investments is a way to in the housing, right? Affordable housing. And when you have affordable housing, make sure it's healthy housing. Don't be moving folks to the lead house that still has lead painted in Baltimore, right? So this stuff, it gets me angry because it shows we don't really value folks. And I think homelessness, again, is an example we don't really value. We're not seeing our shared humanity. I'll stop there.
Yeah. So I'm the chair of the Joint Committee on Ending Homelessness, and it is true that there are quite a number numerically of people in Baltimore City, but also homelessness is a statewide issue. There are people who are experiencing homelessness in St. Mary's County. There are people the people that are living in campgrounds, who are housing insecure in the western part of our state, in Montgomery County, increasingly wherever housing costs are high, right? Or where people used to have the ability, working class people had the ability to make a living, and they can no longer make a living. And so now they're losing their farms and their homes. And so they're living in cars and campgrounds. So we do need a statewide view. And I appreciate the interest in Baltimore, but frankly, we do have we have a lot of the issues, but Baltimore is creating an infrastructure to address it. And so my challenge as the co-chair of Joint Committee on Ending Homelessness is really making sure that other jurisdictions, Montgomery County is doing a really great job. Prince George's County, as a matter of fact, is increasingly doing good work, but we really need to have a statewide perspective, because interestingly, we've had some, not just simply anecdotal, but people have testified in our committee that people who are experiencing homelessness in the surrounding counties of Baltimore sometimes are put on buses and sent to Baltimore. They're kicked away from the rural areas and sent to the cities in some part because we have the services. It is an environmental issue, redlining, housing discrimination, gentrification, so increasing property values and making housing more inaffordable. But it is indeed a statewide problem, and we need a statewide solution.
Thank you. I have one final question written, and then I'll turn it back to Maddie. We were talking about food insecurity earlier, and in the face of climate change, food insecurity is definitely something. This is more of a global issue than just like a statewide sort of thing, but food insecurity in the face of climate change is just terrifying. I mean, we are on the northern hemisphere, so of course we're not going to be getting as much as people in the southern hemisphere will be. But agriculture, the face of agriculture is just changing every day as different climate events are going around. So with the global food system focusing mostly on monocropping it's something that's very easy to happen for it to just completely fall apart. Like, for example, we get all of our avocados from Mexico. If they were to have like a virus or some pest to go through all the avocados, then we just wouldn't have avocados for a year. So Dr. Wilson and also the rabbi mentioned food sovereignty, and sort of, we've been talking a lot about community investment. So what is the best way, in your opinion, for communities to address food insecurity?
This gets me really, really excited when I talk about this. I'm trying to talk too long. We have to focus on food sovereignty, you know, and it's just not just food, it's the food, energy, water, next, it's also land. Land is power, land is health, land is culture, land is wealth. So we need to make sure community focus on land. We need to change zoning so you can have chickens. If you want to have some chickens, you're not a vegan. I mean, everybody's not a vegan. You want to have some chickens in Baltimore? I think you can't have chickens now. Change zoning so you have chickens. You can actually raise bees, right? We have to change zoning. We have to make sure we get rid of a lot of these highways and byways, and like as Delegate Love talked about, the impervious surfaces that contributes to urban heat islands. You bring in green infrastructure, right? So what are trees good for? Heat mitigation, noise mitigation, air pollution mitigation, stormwater mitigation. You can grow food, man. Mental health, playability, contact with nature. So expanding the tree canopy, using trees and green infrastructure in urban agriculture is also, again, an economic opportunity structure. You can bring the farms to the people, do job training around urban ag, cooking programs so people can grow the food the right way, and then make sure you have pollution sources right. Because when you have food disparities, food deserts, you could be living there in major highway. So maybe you have to have hoop houses, maybe you have to have greenhouses. But we really need to have our agricultural investments from the Farm Bill focus more on urban ag, and then we look at rural communities. You know, Mississippi is an ag state, right? Going outside of the state, it has the highest obesity rate in the country. We got to make sure people have access to healthy foods, right? And again, that we're doing more to see food as power and see land as power and reconnect people to land. We came from the earth, we're gonna go back to the earth. So greater connections to the earth and that moral component, I think is really important. I'm gonna stop there, but this is a really important piece. And then just the energy affordability piece too, because when you have more tree canopy, your energy bills less, right? When you have green roofs and green walls, you can deal with stormwater. You have blue roofs and blue walls, you can deal with stormwater. Just really building healthier community ecosystems where food is being at the center. I think Nina said this, food is at the center of what we do. Just changing the way we live. That's the way to go. I'll be quiet. Thank you.
It's actually really exciting, a lot of the work that some of my colleagues in the General Assembly are doing. Delegate Melissa Wells last year had a bill on urban agriculture and increasing funding for that. And Delegate Tarkoudian has been doing a lot with procurement. Tell me why Montgomery County schools are getting their fruits and vegetables from Pennsylvania. We should be getting them from Maryland farmers. We should be getting them from our own neighborhoods. So there's a lot, and I could go on and on about it, but there's a lot of really exciting stuff that is going on in the General Assembly to try to address food insecurity, to try to address making sure that communities have access to healthy food, that they have access to green space, that they have the ability to grow their own food. Haven't gotten into the zoning for chickens yet, but we might need to do that. So it's just, there is a lot of really neat stuff going on. So there's a bright spot there.
Awesome.
And just real quick to add to that, I have a food forest at my house. I mean, basically, I'm trying to build a food forest. I grow almost everything, not everything we eat, but I have 15 raised beds. I have like 130 pots on my deck. I have pomegranates on one side of my house. I got blackberries on the other side of my house. I have 3 apple trees in the front of my house. I grow watermelon. We have to make sure people understand growing your food is power.
Dr.
Right?
Wilson, what time's dinner? Because I'm on my way.
You know, I'm about to go pick some collard greens and some mustard greens for my salad in a few minutes. So I just want to say that we got to get people inspired to really grow their own food. It's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
I had
you
to
all.
relearn how to do that during the pandemic. I live on a working farm. It's been in the family 100 years. My mother, who's 85, lived next door. And we're 2 old people trying to farm together after a long absence because it's become essential. We don't want to go anywhere. we're behind a gate. And so it's been humbling, I must say. The food doesn't grow itself. You really have to be involved. You really have to, participate every day. But I'm much better, frankly, at fixing the equipment. I'm a blacksmith and I can fix tractors and that stuff. They don't let me near the stuff that grows because I have a brown thumb.
Fred, how many acres do you have?
I think the family's got 190 left, and with a woodlot, with a stream.
We're going to come and lease some land from you. We already talked about some of the EJ folks.
Come on down.
Got to create ecotopias, y'all.
All right.
Some land. Make this ecotopia happen.
Yeah. Say my great-grandfather made liquor. He was really good at that, but he wasn't really good at growing others. He made his own booze.
Thank you all for your answer. Agriculture is something that I'm very passionate about. I work on the Kate Chandler campus farm that we have here. I would love to talk about it more with you all, but we don't have much time left. Before I hand it to Maddie, a student asked me if I could compile all of the resources that have been sent in the chat. So I am currently making a document of all of that. So if you guys want to access that afterwards, it'll probably be posted on the Sustainability Office Facebook page by tomorrow. So thank you, and back to Maddie.
Thank you, Atlas, and thank you to all of our amazing speakers. This was truly fantastic. I did have one more question, but in the sake of respecting everyone's time and Dr. Wilson's amazing dinner plans, I will refrain from asking that final question, but I just wanted to say a big thank you again to Nina Cardin, Dr. Wilson, Delegate Love, Senator Washington, and Fred Tutman. You guys are extremely inspirational people. Thank you for tonight, and thank you for all that you do. I learned so much. I just can't thank you enough. And thank you, Emily and Atlas, for being here and helping put this together.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Atlas, especially. I just jumped right in on your questions, but thank you. Those were well articulated.
Thank you, everyone. This was really, really wonderful.
Thank you all. We're all in this together.
That's right.
100%.
Thanks. Y'all take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone that attended.
Bye-bye.